So again, look, I think the first thing we think about summer cropping is well, what can we actually push out of the spring? And it goes back to some of the stuff we've already talked about. Is that I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly if people have got long season Italian ryegrasses, to actually push a fair way into the spring if conditions stay reasonable, with respect to getting a lot more out of the money they've already spent on some of their pastures. We've gone in with good quality, expensive seed. We've had good fertility programs over the winter. You know, before ripping those out too prematurely, let's have a little bit of a think about, well, is there opportunity to get more out of those spring fodders, particularly high quality ryegrass based pastures later in the season. Now that's not going to be for everyone, and some people will have very much stage cropping programs where they're deliberately sown cereals or shorter term annuals that just need to come out at the right time to do the right thing. I think with respect to your summer cropping programs, there's a lot of stuff we need to just throw around, you know, this year that is a bit different. You know, if hay comes in at a very low cost and there's a lot of cheap grain around, it may take, you know, it may encourage you to look at different options with respect to your own summer programs, particularly if you actually know what your actual true crops costs are for growing crop. And again, this is something that a few people forensically take to, you know, at the end of each cropping season to see what their maize has actually cost them. But I do think it's important that you actually look, you know, if you can, at what that maize cropping actually really does cost you each year. And it can be a huge range. And I guess when Dave Dean was running around collecting the samples a few years ago through the forage project out of Sydney Uni, we saw maize coming in at anywhere between 140 and 350 bucks a tonne dry matter, you know, within that population. So I guess if you're economically producing maize silage, you're probably under 230, 240 bucks a tonne dry matter, and also accounting for shrinkage and wastage, then, you know, it's sitting there that's going to be highly competitive with most things you can buy. But if your maize silage costs are getting closer to 300 bucks a tonne dry matter, then I think it's something you just need to look at very, very closely. Okay, particularly when you put that in balance with your potential for buying purchase feeds this year at reasonably good price, but also maybe there might be some other forage options that you want to look at that allow you to potentially just grow some, you know, reasonably digestible fodder that might be lower risk and lower cost to establish. But if you can actually manage, you know, things like forage sorghum well, that may give a lot of people, you know, growing options that they can then complement maybe with just feeding more grain in the dairy. Okay, but it's going to be different for everyone, and we need to look at that spectrum of risk and what you want to spend at the front end. I mean, if you're short of a quid now, going in with an expensive maize cropping program might be more challenging. Whereas if you're well set up to feed maize as part of your feed system, you know, it's an obvious and it's a no-brainer. Okay, because the maize does really, really well, and it is very water use efficient, and particularly if you've got the right feeding facilities and the infrastructure on farm to manage it, it's an obvious and a smart choice. So I guess, you know, there's a whole heap of things that we need to weigh into this decision as to what do we actually grow in summer, all right? Because I think importantly, you know, we need to manage risk, we need to manage costs, we need to be thinking about risks at harvest. Okay, and again, you know, our two big risks on the coast with harvest can be if it gets wet in harvest, we just can't get on our paddocks. Okay, and that can be a very expensive crop if we can't get on those paddocks. And I'm, you know, a little bit concerned about La Nina forecast and harvesting maize on Oxley Island. Okay, the flip side too is, you know, can we get the contractors? And contractors, we've got some great contractors in the industry, but the challenge we get into if they're, you know, interspersed with wet weather is getting them on farm in a timely manner. And I think, you know, Simon in the bottom left corner there with his hands on his head is sort of showing the impact of being held up by fantastic contractors that are well intended, do a wonderful job in the industry, but just couldn't get around to being held up by wet weather. So the forage sorghum that was meant to be cut around the side height of his waist and going to a pit ended up into this sort of jungle situation as well. So there's a lot of stuff to think about in your summer cropping programs. Okay, and I guess part of it, you know, is you know, what are the other opportunities that exist? Okay, starch sources, high energy products like grain are likely to be well priced this year. maybe under $250 a tonne delivered. So is corn silage as important in a situation where you're buying grain in that situation? And maybe it is in your situation, maybe it isn't. Can we push harder in the spring, as we've already mentioned, and be happy to buy a bit more grain? The higher digestibility forage sorghum options, set up nicely in your business. Okay, and again, that can suit some operators that are a bit more removed from contractors and good contracting networks, because they can get out if they've got their own gear, or small local contractor, they can do 3 or 4 cuts. If things run well, they can get on their paddocks again and produce some reasonably good forage, which when paired back with grain, okay, puts us in a situation where you're not far off energetically what we can generate with maize silage. So look, I'll chuck that one all out there. I know Josh and Kyle may have some comments, and some of the other producers in the group about what they're thinking. Be really interested in people's thoughts, because I think that time to be thinking about this stuff is now. Okay, we need to plan for seed, we need to plan for paddock preparation, but I guess we've got to understand what the financials are as well, and particularly when you start throwing in the power costs on the hunter. Okay, the water's there, which is great. Okay, to do the crops, I'm not too worried about that. It's what's the real cost of the fodder costing us, and what are the options, and what do we need to measure up in our decision making.
It's a really good discussion, because it's there is so many options, and often it's not about the right or wrong decision. It's about going through the process and coming up with what you want to do, and then implementing it, I guess, is so yes, there's obviously we've got sorghums and maizes and everything we can do, but if we're looking outside of that, things like cash crops, or I call them as such, or things like brassicas and chicories, a really good option now as well. So the good thing about them is, if you do have some country where you put some annual ryegrasses or whatever you're going to pull out, or you got some extra dryland that you didn't plant anything in, having somewhere we can grow those cash crop type plants where you can put the animals on and take more pressure off your areas where you have got ryegrass and things like that, so you could potentially conserve and store more silage that way. That's another option. So that way you're feeding really high quality feed source through the spring, and then you're storing a fair bit of that real good quality ryegrass and things that you've got in crops as well. So that's another option if you didn't want to go down the fully cropping side of the sorghum or the maize. And I think this thing around, I reckon I've had the most calls this year on, and that's about this La Nina and wet conditions and the risks of growing maize, because I'm just about to reply to a text message here now, but the biggest cost to growing maize is not achieving what you need to achieve. So as soon as you only end up getting 10 tonne or 12 tonne or 15 tonne, that really impacts on the cost per tonne. So it's all good to put a spreadsheet out there and say we want to get 20, 24 tonne. But then when we don't achieve that, all of a sudden that cost that Neil's put up there now, instead of it being $209 a tonne, it goes to $400 a tonne pretty quick. And that would have been some of those numbers that they'd done at the Sydney Uni, because at the end of the day, it's the risk side of it. So on the other side of that, I guess the area I've been working on the last sort of 3 or 4 years with Kyle and stuff as well, and is on these shorter season type maizes and reducing that risk. So we still sit there and we've been getting 22, 24 tonne, but we've been achieving that between sort of 85 to 96 days compared to 120, 130 days. And where we're looking to do that, some of those were harvested in early January, so 2nd of January. Some of those are harvested, planted on the 20th of September. So typically, if we're going to get that wet, flooding, risk rain, typically it's in that March period when all that sort of starts to happen. And typically in history, when we're putting these long season varieties, that's when we're looking at harvesting them. So there is an opportunity to look at that. And even, if you're doing forage sorghum and you get a good quality one, I'd advocate, making sure you get good quality BMR type sorghums. Again, making sure you cut them that metre high and not letting them go away. Keep the fertiliser up to them so you've got the good protein in them. And then, at least you've had a few cuts off them by the time you get to that January, February period anyway. If it does come in, you haven't got the cost of missing out on harvest. You've actually had two cuts off it potentially already. So that's another thing to think of. But yeah, I think, thinking about the risk of what the weather might do, utilising the moisture we have at the moment, like we talked about earlier. So what options have we got there? And Kyle might name a few more, but your whole brassica, chicory type scenario is where you're going to grow really good, high quality feed right up to Christmas. So you could use that moisture for that sort of period. But yeah, and then look at the risk at the other end of flooding and everything else.
Terrific, Josh. No, it's a real nice, and those grazing options are, particularly if the chicory's under there, they can continue well after the Christmas period. So yeah, Kyle, you might have some stuff to add, mate, on that.
Yeah, look, I guess the key thing is, and as you said, Neil, and Josh as well, is making sure you know what you need. It's going to be one of those years with cheaper cereal, hay prices and things like that. If you're not after the bulk commodity of feed and you're chasing quality, maybe corn's not the option this year. Obviously, there's still quality in it, but working out what you need for your system going forward. Sorghums and things like that may be an option. Supplying things looks really good. So for answering that question, there doesn't seem to be a seed supply issue with forages at this stage. Some corns have started to tighten up. But yeah, I guess again, it's about planning, and things are tight with that corn budget when you've got cereal, hay and things being able to be bought in as cheap as what it's going to be this year. So you really need to, last year it was a no-brainer, growing corn and good sorghum crops with hay prices being what they were coming into summer. So the pressure's a little bit higher this year on, I guess, costs. I guess would be my biggest focus, making sure you don't tie yourself up in that risk factor of, cost per tonne of dry matter when you can buy feed in.
Yep. Excellent, Kyle. What about some of the growers out there and producers? What are people thinking? Have anyone got, the whole summer forage, there's a plethora of things that we have available out there. Does anyone have any specific questions that we could throw at the group while we're talking about this?
Yeah, Neil, it's Pete.
Hey, Pete.
I was just wondering if there was a high quality sorghum or like something you get a few cuts off.
Yep. Look, I'd say that we sorghum, and it's never going to be ryegrass. And I guess that's the thing to be comfortable with.
Yeah.
If we're looking at quality, we would normally recommend one of the BMR varieties. So the BMR stands for brown midrib. Okay, now the brown midrib is a gene that was introduced into sorghums quite a few years ago, and it's also in some corns in the States. That means that forage component of it is much more digestible, and it's up to sort of 8 to 10% more digestible than the non-BMR varieties. There tends to be a bit of an offset in yield. They tend to probably yield a little less, most of them, over the season. But certainly from a feed quality, when we've side-by-sided, forage sorghum and BMR and non-BMR varieties, we pick up about a megajoule to megajoule and a half difference at the same cutting height. So that's quite important if we're looking at multi-cuts. So I'd look, I'd be looking at stuff like Rocket out of Pacific, for a fairly quick one. It's as good as any at the moment. I don't know what's coming out of some of the other stables at the moment. The Beamer, which was a reasonable line out of Seed Force, it did pretty well. It was a BMR sedan cross. I don't think righties have got anything really in the space. Kyle, you might have some other options out there. The Rocket, I thought, has been a pretty good all-rounder in that space. Things like the Super Sedan, and there's some good options there, like the Triple S, but they are a bit less digestible at the same height. And the other one, which is going really well, is what they call the Sprint. Sprint out of Pack, which is another sedan cross. Really fantastic forages, but probably again a touch behind on quality, but tremendous yield and growth and grazing potential is also conservation potential.
I think one of the key things there to add to it, obviously, side by side, you are going to notice a difference in those BMRs, and that's been said. But get your management right. It's even those BMRs are going to lose quality if they go beyond optimal. So getting that cut height right, getting the cut timing right, if you're taking it off as silage or hay or whatever it may be, we see it time and time again. It just gets too far, goes too far and just loses. Sorghum's something that does lose quality very, very quickly. once it goes past. So, yeah, and just the fact they don't eat it, that's the other problem. You know, if it gets past optimal.
Absolutely. And look, there's a whole heap of things to think about in harvest, but you know, they talk about a metre. Realistically, you probably want to be looking at a higher density of plant coming in at about 80 centimetres to really have good quality. So probably upping your seeding rate will help with that, but also then looking at a slightly shorter cut. I think then keeping your fertility up, and particularly your nitrogen on those. They're nitrogen hungry crops. Managing your potassium outflow, we tend to budget sorghum at about 1.5% dry matter potassium outflow rather than the 2%. And the grasses, corn's about 1%. And again, when you're baling, okay, and particularly if it does get a bit leggy, trying to, because one of the things we see with baled sorghum is a lot of wastage when it's fed out, okay? Cattle will graze into a bale and they'll rip a big lump of it out, they'll chew the leaves off it, and then they'll drop the stem. So with your baling gear, if you've got it, or if you're working with a contractor, trying to get that sorghum cut as it's going into the bale. So pre-chopping sorghum into the bale makes a huge difference to your wastage at the other end and gets us through some of those issues to a degree where we see a lot of it being rejected and dropped on the ground. So there's some practical stuff in that space as well, as well as a variety. But something like BMR Rocket's going to do a really, really nice job up there for you guys, and we can talk about some other varieties too that might hit the nail on the head. I don't know if anyone else has got anything. Luke, you guys have done a lot of forage sorghum. What's your experience been? When you guys tend to do a short quality cut early and then a bulk up crop to give us some fodder to go back with, you know, as a fibre source rather than a fodder source. But yeah, what are you guys thinking this year?
Yeah, I'll probably talk to you again, but at this stage, depending on how much ryegrass we can bale up, we have used that sorghum silage to get a good bulk of silage a lot of the times, and also your weather can catch you fairly quickly, and it goes from metre high up to the cab of the tractor, so you've just got to deal with it depending on what the weather does. And yeah, we had grown corn, but we went away from that because of that same issue with the weather. And the last crop of corn we got in was between two floods, and just fortunately we got it off, and to the contractors being at the mercy of them, and the sort of varieties were coming up around Easter time and they shut the highway to move oversized loads, etc. So it was just too hard when we had our own gear in the shed, we could handle it. Again, as you said, trying not to have it get out of control, because then all you've got is that stalk. Some of the things, we've got knives in our baler, and we've also this year purchased a bale slicer, which puts a knife straight up through the middle of the bale. It keeps the net and the plastic as well, and we drop that into our TMR wagon and chop it as well. So there's a fair bit involved in all of that, but that's probably best scenario. The worst scenario would be to put it just in a ring feeder, just by simply unwrapping it. You'd see a huge amount of wastage. They'd basically try and pull the leaf off it. I mean, the plus side, we went from 0 silage reserves this year, and with your help, Neil, and took our planting didn't happen until this 15th of January, which is very late, and took it out for one big cut. And in 2 days, we'd made 600 bales of silage off 2 baling attempts, 2 days of 300 each. So, you know, that's the sort of yield you can get, and that was what we were trying to do. Whereas this year, it could all change. But and we can graze it too, is the other advantage we've found with the sorghum. And it gives you a few more options, and the corn's just the one. The quality is a little bit, you've got to accept that a bit and be willing to maybe have a mixer wagon or something to add a bits to it. But yeah, it does work well for us. Farms not far away grow corn very successfully, depending on what country you've got. And last year, some of the corn crops around here, there was no grain on the cobs because of the dry weathers, and we got a good sorghum crop in the end. So yeah, I'd say it's a pretty safe summer starting thing, and it gives you those couple of options whether you want to graze it or bale it. Peter, yeah.
Look, that's
Yes.
excellent, Luke. Does that help, Pete?
Yeah,
Yeah, cool. So look, I
I guess it's just tossing up between sorghum and the millet. Like,
I missed that, sorry, Peter.
I'm guessing millet would be a high quality.
Well, look, millet's a really interesting one. I mean,
I know you're only going to get one cut.
yeah, look, you can get a couple again with millet, particularly on an early sowing on millet. You know, if you're sowing it in sort of late September, October, you can get a couple of cuts on millet if you don't let it go too far. If you sow millet late, it tends to want to bolt. In many ways, I like millet because it doesn't hang around too long and people aren't as late getting their winter feed in if they've got millet in as opposed to forage sorghum, because forage sorghum just starts looking good when people need to knock it over in March, April to put their winter feed in. So look, there's a bit of psychology there and what crops are most suited. The other thing to not walk away from is your kikuyu, okay? And again, there'll be guys here in the group that have made a lot of reasonably good kikuyu silage over time. And we shouldn't necessarily think that the only option is crops. You know, pushing our kikuyu base harder with fertiliser through the summer is certainly another option to consider, which is much lower risk, okay, and much lower cost to establish. So if you've got a good kikuyu base, you know, the last thing I'd be doing would be ploughing it up to grow a sorghum crop. You know, I think just fertilising it and doing well with that can be as productive and much lower cost and lower risk than going in with the cropping approach as well. So I guess the message is it's horses for courses, and knowing what you want the feed for is probably the most critical thing, and then going through the planning, you know, be it dryland or irrigation. You know, I think start planning now. If you're dryland in particular, start fallowing and storing your moisture. So, you know, we'd really like to see at least 100 millimetres of soil accumulated, particularly in heavier soils. Use options that allow you to use pre-emergence, okay? Because the weeds are going to be a problem. They're always a problem, okay? And being able to use the pre-emergence as part of your weed strategy is critical. And again, if you're talking to your supply, making sure your forage sorghum are concept treated, you know we can sow once that soil temp's above 16 degrees at about 9 in the morning for 3 days in a row. Always sow with starters, but actively follow up with nitrogen as the season progresses. And again, don't be afraid to utilise natural summer grasses if that's what we've got, because, you know, with fertiliser and good rotation management and keeping them at the right length, they can be pretty good options as well. All right. So look, right crop, right time of year, soil test early. And again, this comes back to some of the stuff Kyle was mentioning before. Understand your soils, get those soil tests done, and make sure if we are going to chase things like corn, we're chasing with appropriate nutrient packs to go in there. Sow and establish where possible before those high temps hit. And this is some stuff that, again, Josh mentioned with some of those early sowing options with corn, you know, and looking at the shorter season opportunities that may exist. But again, if you're going to go short season in your area where your contractors aren't thick on the ground, make sure you talk to your contractor first. That should be the first call you make with corn, is to your harvest contractor to find out when they're likely to be around. Control your weeds and look at your best practice planting techniques, you know, to ensure we've got good seed soil contact and placement. And that goes for sorghum as well. Okay, sorghum again needs really good seed soil contact if the soils are starting to dry out. So again, using rollers and press wheels is really, really important when we go there. You know, planning should involve discussion with your contractors. Secure your seed early. And again, you know, understand the purpose of the crop. Is it forage? Is it starch? Is it effective fibre? And again, being really focused with your variety selection this year, if you're going to do corn, on high quality varieties rather than the highest yielding varieties. You know, I'd be chasing varieties that are at the higher end of starch production, you know, if that came with reasonable yield as well. But again, remember, homegrown feed can look very cheap to produce, but it can be very costly to utilise if it's rubbish. Okay, we get left with these big stacks of stuff that we need to find a home for. And people say, well, I'm only getting, you know, X litres a cow. And I said, well, I can't do much more with that if we've got 200 or 300 or 400 tonne of 8 megajoule silage to burn through. So again, years like this where you may be carrying through a bit of inventory from last year, or you're having a good spring, if you're going into a summer crop system, quality is king.